Hamas versus Israel. Is this biblical? Absolutely. Before I get into understanding it, the Bible seems to repeat itself, and the same characters, the same characters appear throughout the Bible. Only you don't know what your character is. So let's take an example of a movie, Christmas Carol. How about that? It's the same characters, but they made the movie several times, and the actors are different. So, like you have Alistair Sims as Scrooge, and another you have different characters. But the Bible's the same way. There are defined characters, and people take these characters and they take these roles. They may not even know that they're in these roles. So, I'll give you an example of that. Um, Jesus said in Matthew 17:12 that Elijah had come, but you didn't see him, you didn't recognize him. And pair that with what John said in chapter 1:21. The Pharisees sent a crew to John the Baptist, and they asked him, they said, "Are you the Messiah?" He said, "No." He said, "Are you Elijah?" And he said, "No," when Jesus had already said he was Elijah. So now you get the understanding. You may not even know your role in this whole thing. So now let's get to Exodus. Exodus 17, 7 to 16. Okay. Amalek, when the Jews left the land and Jesus brought them to Rephidim, Amalek attacked the Jews from the rear, through the women, through the children. And this really angered God. We found out in Deuteronomy, when Moses gave us a rundown of it again, that God was really angry. But in Exodus 17:16, God comes right out and says it. About Amalek, they said, I will be at war with you from generation to generation forever. Okay. Numbers 33, starting in 53. God tells the Jews that they have to consume all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, when they go in. Otherwise, there'll be a prick and a thorn in their side forever. This is a very important thing that gets us going into the direction we need to go to understand what's happening with Hamas and Israel. That brings us to 1 Samuel. In chapter 15, Saul, the first king of Israel, was told to go and defeat Amalek, because God was still holding a grudge and said for the wars to continue. So he wanted them consumed: men, women, children, animals, everything. But Saul disobeyed. He brought back the King Agag, back with him, and some of the animals that he would say he was going to use to sacrifice. And when Samuel heard this, Samuel was furious, because God told him, God was furious. So Samuel came back and said, "What'd you do? You brought back the king?" And then Samuel quickly killed King Agag. Now let's talk about Gaza a little bit. Gaza has a long history to it. When the Jews came out of Egypt and they looped around underneath, God took them away from the Philistines, so that there wasn't a premature battle before he brought them up into Rephidim. Got to remember also, Gaza was the place of Samson. If you remember Samson and Delilah, his exploits down there: married a Philistine woman, then ended up divorcing her, took another Philistine woman, which ended up being Delilah. That's a storied history too. That all took place. If you think about what Samson did, when Samson was mad at the end, he disobeyed God. But at the end, if you remember his exploits, he took the gates off of Gaza, the gates and the posts, he carried them off. All this took place in Gaza. And if you remember Samson's death, when his eyes were put out after his hair was cut and he lost all his power, he was going to be tied, and they had him in a building where 3,000 Philistines were, and he asked to hold on to the posts, and he grabbed a hold of the posts, and with his last mighty call on God for strength, he pulled down the posts and dropped the building and killed 3,000 people. And that's just a little bit of the background of Gaza. But Israel was at war with the Philistines in Gaza almost constantly. And that brings you more up to what's going to happen today.
The denouement.
Now, let's try to bring this to some sort of conclusion. So we know a little bit of the back history between Amalek and Gaza and what's going on. Now, let's talk about modern times. And like I said in the beginning, where I was talking about, maybe it didn't make much sense, but I was talking about how people are in roles that they don't even realize. So I think Hamas is in the role of Amalek. Because if you remember what God said, there'll be war from generation to generation. And if you look how Hamas attacks Israel, it's the same that Amalek did when they got to Rephidim. Remember, they attacked through the rear and came up, and which made God angry. But if you notice how Hamas attacks Israel, they don't attack military places. They attack the civilians, soft targets, hospitals, dances, these kind of things. This is the same thing. So now let's get to Leviticus 26:8, and this will sound kind of familiar when you watch the imagery from this war. It's very funny how it. If you look at the imagery of some of the pictures of these buildings just dropping, you almost see the images of Samson pulling out the post and dropping the building. Very, very similar. And if you look at how many military forces are chasing how many people, it's like God said in Leviticus 26, 5 will chase 100, 100 will chase 10,000. If you remember all that, I don't know if you do, but Leviticus 26, I think, is where you'll find that. So now, if you look at everything that's happening, you get this final, like every 10, 15 years, they start lobbing into Israel. So I think this is basically what you see. Am I surprised at the carnage? No, I'm actually not. I think Hamas has this right when they say, this is a holy war, and I'm glad they sort of said that, because at least they recognize the fact that if you battle Israel in the land given to them by God, you're basically on the battlefield with God. So they could be consumed. Men, women, children, animals. I think that's it.